typically use to orient ourselves. I had a vision once of an immense landscape spread for miles out to the horizon before me. I was high in the air, granted a bird's-eye view. Everywhere I could see great stratified multi-story pyramids of glass, some small, some large, some overlapping, some separate, all akin to modern skyscrapers, all full of people striving to reach each pyramid's very pinnacle. But there was something above that pinnacle, a domain outside each pyramid, in which all were nested. That was the privileged position of the eye that could, or perhaps chose, to soar freely above the fray, that chose not to dominate any specific group or cause, but instead to somehow simultaneously transcend all. That was attention itself, pure and untrammeled. Detached, alert, watchful intention, waiting to act when the time was right and the place had been established. As the Tao Te Ching has it, "He who contrives defeats his purpose, and he who is grasping loses. The sage does not contrive to win, and therefore is not defeated. He is not grasping, so does not lose." There is a powerful call to proper being in the story of the third temptation. To obtain the greatest possible prize, the establishment of the kingdom of God on earth, the resurrection of paradise. The individual must conduct his or her life in a manner that requires the rejection of immediate gratification, of natural and perverse desires alike, no matter how powerfully and convincingly and realistically those are offered, and dispense as well with the temptations of evil. Evil amplifies the catastrophes of life, increasing dramatically the motivation for expediency already there because of the essential tragedy of being. Sacrifice of the more prosaic sort can keep that tragedy at bay more or less successfully, but it takes a special kind of sacrifice to defeat evil. It is the description of that special sacrifice that has preoccupied the Christian, and more than Christian, imagination for centuries. Why has it not had the desired effect? Why do we remain unconvinced that there is no better plan than lifting our eyes skyward, aiming at the good, and sacrificing everything to that ambition? Have we merely failed to understand, or have we fallen willfully, or otherwise, off the path? Christianity and its problems. Carl Jung hypothesized that the European mind found itself motivated to develop the cognitive technologies of science, to investigate the material world, after implicitly concluding that Christianity, with its laser-like emphasis on spiritual salvation, had failed to sufficiently address the problem of suffering in the here and now. This realization became unbearably acute in the 3 or 4 centuries before the Renaissance. In consequence, a strange, profound, compensatory fantasy began to emerge deep in the collective Western psyche, manifesting itself first in the strange musings of alchemy, and developing, only after many centuries, into the fully articulated form of science. It was the alchemists who first seriously began to examine the transformations of matter, hoping to discover the secrets of health, wealth, and longevity. These great dreamers, Newton foremost among them, intuited and then imagined that the material world, damned by the Church, held secrets the revelation of which could free humanity from its earthly pain and limitations. It was that vision, driven by doubt, that provided the tremendous collective and individual motivational power necessary for the development of science, with its extreme demands on individual thinkers for concentration and delay of gratification. This is not to say that Christianity, even in its incompletely realized form, was a failure. Quite the contrary. Christianity achieved the well-nigh impossible. The Christian doctrine elevated the individual soul, placing slave and master and commoner and nobleman alike on the same metaphysical footing, rendering them equal before God and the law. Christianity insisted that even the king was only one among many. For something so contrary to all apparent evidence to find its footing, the idea that worldly power and prominence were indicators of God's particular favor had to be radically de-emphasized. This was partly accomplished through the strange Christian insistence that salvation could not be attained through effort or worth, through works. Whatever its limitations, the development of such doctrine prevented king, aristocrat, and wealthy merchant alike from lording it morally over the commoner. In consequence, the metaphysical conception of the implicit, transcendent worth of each and every soul established itself against impossible odds as the fundamental presupposition of Western law and society. That was not the case in the world of the past, and is not the case yet in most places in the world of the present. It is in fact nothing short of a miracle, and we should keep that fact firmly before our eyes, that the hierarchical slave-based societies of our ancestors reorganized themselves under the sway of an ethical/religious revelation such that the ownership and absolute domination of another person came to be viewed as wrong. It would do us well to remember as well that the immediate utility of slavery is obvious, and that the argument that the strong should dominate the weak is compelling, convenient, and eminently practical, at least for the strong. This means that a revolutionary critique of everything slave-owning societies valued was necessary before the practice could even be questioned, let alone halted, including the idea that wielding power and authority made the slave owner noble, including the even more fundamental idea that the power wielded by the slave owner was valid and even virtuous. Christianity made explicit the surprising claim that even the lowliest person had rights, genuine rights, and that sovereign and state were morally charged at a fundamental level to recognize those rights. Christianity put forward explicitly the even more incomprehensible idea that the act of human ownership degraded the slaver, previously viewed as admirable nobility, as much or even more than the slave. We fail to understand how difficult such an idea is to grasp. We forget that the opposite was self-evident throughout most of human history. We think that it is the desire to enslave and dominate that requires explanation. We have it backwards yet again. This is not to say that Christianity was without its problems, but it is more appropriate to note that they were the sort of problems that emerge only after an entirely different set of more serious problems has been solved. The society produced by Christianity was far less barbaric than the pagan, even the Roman ones it replaced. Christian society at least recognized that feeding slaves to ravenous lions for the entertainment of the populace was wrong, even if many barbaric practices still existed. It objected to infanticide, to prostitution, and to the principle that might means right. It insisted that women were as valuable as men, even though we are still working out how to manifest that insistence politically. It demanded that even a society's enemies be regarded as human. Finally, it separated church from state so that all too human emperors could no longer claim the veneration due to gods. All of this was asking the impossible, but it happened. As the Christian Revolution progressed, however, the impossible problems it had solved disappeared from view. That's what happens to problems that are solved, and after the solution was implemented, even the fact that such problems had ever existed disappeared from view. Then and only then could the problems that remained less amenable to quick solution by Christian doctrine came to occupy a central place in the consciousness of the West. Come to motivate, for example, the development of science aimed at resolving the corporeal material suffering that was still all too painfully extant within successfully Christianized societies. The fact that automobiles pollute only becomes a problem of sufficient magnitude to attract public attention when the far worse problems that the internal combustion engine solves has vanished from view. People stricken with poverty don't care about carbon dioxide. It's not precisely that CO2 levels are irrelevant. It's that they're irrelevant when you're working yourself to death, starving, scraping a bare living from the stony, unyielding thorn and thistle-infested ground. It's that they're irrelevant until after the tractor is invented and hundreds of millions stop starving. In any case, by the time Nietzsche entered the picture, in the late 19th century, the problems Christianity had left unsolved had become paramount. Nietzsche described himself, with no serious overstatement, as philosophizing with a hammer. His devastating critique of Christianity, already weakened by its conflict with the very science to which it had given rise, involved two main lines of attack. Nietzsche claimed, first, that it was precisely the sense of truth developed in the highest sense by Christianity itself that ultimately came to question, and then to undermine the fundamental presuppositions of the faith. That was partly because the difference between moral or narrative truth and objective truth had not yet been fully comprehended, and so an opposition was presumed where none necessarily exists. But that does not belie the point. Even when the modern atheists opposed to Christianity belittle fundamentalists for insisting, for example, that the creation account in Genesis is objectively true, they are using their sense of truth, highly developed over the centuries of Christian culture, to engage in such argumentation. Carl Jung continued to develop Nietzsche's arguments decades later, pointing out that Europe awoke during the Enlightenment, as if from a Christian dream, noticing that everything it had heretofore taken for granted could and should be questioned. God is dead, said Nietzsche. God remains dead, and we have killed him. How shall we, murderers of all murderers, console ourselves? That which was the holiest and mightiest of all that the world has yet possessed, has bled to death under our knives. Who will wipe this blood off of us? The central dogmas of the Western faith were no longer credible, according to Nietzsche, given that the Western mind now considered truth. But it was his second attack, on the removal of the true moral burden of Christianity during the development of the Church, that was most devastating. The hammer-wielding philosopher mounted an assault on an early established and then highly influential line of Christian thinking. That Christianity meant accepting the proposition that Christ's sacrifice, and only that sacrifice, had redeemed humanity. This did not mean absolutely that a Christian who believed that Christ died on the cross for the salvation of mankind was thereby freed from any and all personal moral obligation, but it did strongly imply that the primary responsibility for redemption had already been borne by the Savior, and that nothing too important to do remained for all too fallen human individuals. Nietzsche believed that Paul, and later the Protestants following Luther, had removed moral responsibility from Christ's followers. They had watered down the idea of the imitation of Christ. This imitation was the sacred duty of the believer not to adhere, or merely to mouth, a set of statements about abstract belief, but instead to actually manifest the Spirit of the Savior in the particular, specific conditions of his or her life. To realize or incarnate the archetype, as Jung had it, to clothe the eternal pattern in flesh. Nietzsche writes, "The Christians never practiced the actions Jesus prescribed them, and the impudent, garrulous talk about the justification by faith and its supreme and sole significance is only the consequence of the Church's lack of courage and will to profess the works Jesus demanded." Nietzsche was, indeed, a critic without parallel. Dogmatic belief in the central axioms of Christianity, that Christ's crucifixion redeemed the world, that salvation was reserved for the hereafter, and that salvation could not be achieved through works, had three mutually reinforcing consequences. First, devaluation of the significance of earthly life as only the hereafter mattered. This also meant that it had become acceptable to overlook and shirk responsibility for the suffering that existed in the here and now. Second, passive acceptance of the status quo because salvation could not be earned in any case through effort in this life, a consequence that Marx also derided with his proposition that religion was the opiate of the masses. And finally, third, the right of the believer to reject any real moral burden outside of the stated belief in salvation through Christ, because the Son of God had already done all the important work. It was for such reasons that Dostoevsky, who was a great influence on Nietzsche, also criticized institutional Christianity, although he arguably managed it in a more ambiguous but also more sophisticated manner. In his masterwork, The Brothers Karamazov, Dostoevsky had his atheist Superman, Ivan, tell a little story. The Grand Inquisitor. A brief review is in order. Ivan speaks to his brother Alyosha, whose pursuits as a monastic novitiate he holds in contempt, of Christ returning to earth at the time of the Spanish Inquisition. The returning savior makes quite a ruckus, as would be expected. He heals the sick, he raises the dead. His antics soon attract attention from the Grand Inquisitor himself, who promptly has Christ arrested and thrown into a prison cell. Later, the Inquisitor pays him a visit. He informs Christ that he is no longer needed. His return is simply too great a threat to the Church. The Inquisitor tells Christ that the burden he laid on mankind, the burden of existence in faith and truth, was simply too great for mere mortals to bear. The Inquisitor claims that the Church, in its mercy, diluted that message, lifting the demand for perfect being from the shoulders of its followers, providing them instead with the simple and merciful escapes of faith and the afterlife. That work took centuries, says the Inquisitor, and the last thing the Church needs after all that effort is the return of the man who insisted that people bear all the weight in the first place. Christ listens in silence. Then, as the Inquisitor turns to leave, Christ embraces him and kisses him on the lips. The Inquisitor turns white in shock. Then he goes out, leaving the cell door open. The profundity of this story and the greatness of spirit necessary to produce it can hardly be exaggerated. Dostoevsky, one of the great literary geniuses of all time, confronted the most serious existential problems in all his great writings, and he did so courageously, headlong, and heedless of the consequences. Clearly Christian, he nonetheless adamantly refuses to make a straw man of his rationalist and atheistic opponents. Quite the contrary. Karamazov, for example, Dostoevsky's atheist Ivan, argues against the presuppositions of Christianity with unsurpassable clarity and passion. Alyosha, aligned with the Church by temperament and decision, cannot undermine a single one of his brother's arguments, although his faith remains unshakable. Dostoevsky knew and admitted that Christianity had been defeated by the rational faculty, by the intellect even. But, and this is of primary importance, he did not hide from that fact. He didn't attempt through denial or deceit or even satire to weaken the position that opposed what he believed to be most true and valuable. He instead placed action above words and addressed the problem successfully. By the novel's end, Dostoevsky has the great embodied moral goodness of Alyosha, the novitiate's courageous imitation of Christ, attained victory over the spectacular but ultimately nihilistic critical intelligence of Ivan. The Christian Church described by the Grand Inquisitor is the same Church pilloried by Nietzsche. Childish, sanctimonious, patriarchal, servant of the state. That Church is everything rotten still objected to by modern critics of Christianity. Nietzsche, for all his brilliance, allows himself anger but does not perhaps sufficiently temper it with judgment. This is where Dostoevsky truly transcends Nietzsche, in my estimation, where Dostoevsky's great literature transcends Nietzsche's mere philosophy. The Russian writer's Inquisitor is the genuine article in every sense. He is an opportunistic, cynical, manipulative, and cruel interrogator willing to persecute heretics, even to torture and kill them. He is the purveyor of a dogma he knows to be false. But Dostoevsky has Christ, the archetypal perfect man, kiss him anyway. Equally importantly, in the aftermath of the kiss, the Grand Inquisitor leaves the door ajar so Christ can escape his pending execution. Dostoevsky saw that the great, corrupt edifice of Christianity still managed to make room for the spirit of its founder. That's the gratitude of a wise and profound soul for the enduring wisdom of the West, despite its faults. It's not as if Nietzsche was unwilling to give the faith, and more particularly Catholicism, its due. Nietzsche believed that the long tradition of unfreedom characterizing dogmatic Christianity, its insistence that everything be explained within the confines of a single coherent metaphysical theory, was a necessary precondition for the emergence of the disciplined but free modern mind. As he stated in Beyond Good and Evil, "The long bondage of the spirit, the persistent spiritual will to interpret everything that happened according to a Christian scheme, and in every occurrence to rediscover and justify the Christian God in every accident, all this violence, arbitrariness, severity, dreadfulness, and unreasonableness, has proved itself the disciplinary means whereby the European spirit has attained its strength, its remorseless curiosity and subtle mobility. Granted also that much irrecoverable strength and spirit had to be stifled, suffocated, and spoiled in the process." For Nietzsche and Dostoevsky alike, freedom, even the ability to act, requires constraint. For this reason, they both recognize the vital necessity of the dogma of the Church, The individual must be constrained, molded, even brought close to destruction by a restrictive, coherent, disciplinary structure before he or she can act freely and competently. Dostoevsky, with his great generosity of spirit, granted to the church, corrupt as it might be, a certain element of mercy, a certain pragmatism. He admitted that the spirit of Christ, the world-engendering Logos, had historically, and might still find its resting place, even its sovereignty, within that dogmatic structure. If a father disciplines his son properly, he obviously interferes with his freedom, particularly in the here and now. He puts limits on the voluntary expression of his son's being, forcing him to take his place as a socialized member of the world. Such a father requires that all that childish potential be funneled down a single pathway. In placing such limitations on his son, he might be considered a destructive force, acting as he does to replace the miraculous plurality of childhood with a single narrow actuality. But if the father does not take such action, he merely lets his son remain Peter Pan, the eternal boy, king of the lost boys, ruler of the non-existent Neverland. That is not a morally acceptable alternative. The dogma of the church was undermined by the spirit of truth strongly developed by the church itself. That undermining culminated in the death of God. But the dogmatic structure of the church was a necessary disciplinary structure. A long period of unfreedom, adherence to a singular interpretive structure is necessary for the development of a free mind. Christian dogma provided that unfreedom, but the dogma is dead, at least to the modern Western mind. It perished along with God. What has emerged from behind its corpse, however, and this is an issue of central importance, is something even more dead, something that was never alive even in the past. Nihilism, as well as an equally dangerous susceptibility to new, totalizing utopian ideas. It was in the aftermath of God's death that the great collective horrors of communism and fascism sprang forth, as both Dostoevsky and Nietzsche predicted they would. Nietzsche, for his part, posited that individual human beings would have to invent their own values in the aftermath of God's death. But this is the element of his thinking that appears weakest psychologically. We cannot invent our own values because we cannot merely impose what we believe on our souls. This was Carl Jung's great discovery, made in no little part because of his intense study of the problems posed by Nietzsche. We rebel against our own totalitarianism as much as that of others. I cannot merely order myself to action, and neither can you. I will stop procrastinating, I say, but I don't. I will eat properly, I say, but I don't. I will end my drunken misbehavior, I say, but I don't. I cannot merely make myself over in the image constructed by my intellect, particularly if that intellect is possessed by an ideology. I have a nature, and so do you, and so do we all. We must discover that nature and contend with it before making peace with ourselves. What is it that we most truly are? What is it that we could most truly become knowing who we most truly are? We must get to the very bottom of things before such questions can truly be answered. Doubt, past mere nihilism. 300 years before Nietzsche, the great French philosopher René Descartes set out on an intellectual mission to take his doubts seriously, to break things apart, to get what was essential, to see if he could establish or discover a single proposition impervious to his skepticism. He was searching for the foundation stone on which proper being could be established. Descartes found it, as far as he was concerned, in the I who thinks, the I who was aware, as expressed in his famous dictum, cogito ergo sum, I think, therefore I am. But that I had been conceptualized long before. Thousands of years ago, the aware I was the all-seeing eye of Horus, the great Egyptian sun and sun god, who renewed the state by attending to and then confronting its inevitable corruption. Before that, it was the creator god Marduk of the Mesopotamians, whose eyes encircled his head and who spoke forth words of world-engendering magic. During the Christian epoch, the I transformed into the Logos, the word that speaks order into being at the beginning of time. It might be said that Descartes merely secularized the Logos, turning it more explicitly into that which is aware and thinks. That's the modern self, simply put. But what exactly is that self? We can understand to some degree its horrors if we wish to, but its goodness remains more difficult to define. The self is the great actor of evil who strode about the stage of being as Nazi and Stalinist alike, who produced Auschwitz, Buchenwald, Dachau, and the multiplicity of the Soviet gulags. And all of that must be considered with dread seriousness. But what is its opposite? What is the good that is the necessary counterpart of that evil, that is made more corporeal and comprehensible by the very existence of that evil? And here we can state with conviction and clarity that even the rational intellect, the faculty so beloved of those who hold traditional wisdom in contempt, is at minimum something closely and necessarily akin to the archetypal dying and eternally resurrected God, the eternal savior of humanity, the Logos itself. The philosopher of science Karl Popper, certainly no mystic, regarded thinking itself as a logical extension of the Darwinian process. A creature that cannot think must solely embody its being. It can merely act out its nature concretely in the here and now. If it cannot manifest in its behavior what the environment demands while doing so, it will simply die. But that is not true of human beings. We can produce abstracted representations of potential modes of being. We can produce an idea in the theater of the imagination. We can test it out against other ideas, the ideas of others, or the world itself. If it falls short, we can let it go. We can, in Popper's formulation, let our ideas die in our stead. Then the essential part, the creator of those ideas, can continue onward, now untrammeled by comparison with error. Faith in the part of us that continues across those deaths is a prerequisite to thinking itself. Now, an idea is not the same thing as a fact. A fact is something that is dead in and of itself. It has no consciousness, no will to power, no motivation, no action. There are billions of dead facts. The internet is a graveyard of dead facts. But an idea that grips a person is alive. It wants to express itself, to live in the world. It is for this reason that the depth psychologists, Freud and Jung, paramount among them, insisted that the human psyche was a battleground for ideas. An idea has an aim. It wants something. It posits a value structure. An idea believes that what it is aiming for is better than what it has now. It reduces the world to those things that aid or impede its realization, and it reduces everything else to irrelevance. An idea defines figure against ground. An idea is a personality, not a fact. When it manifests itself within a person, it has a strong proclivity to make that person its avatar, to impel that person to act it out. Sometimes that impulsion, possession is another word, can be so strong that the person will die, rather than allowing the idea to perish. This is, generally speaking, a bad decision, given that it is often the case that only the idea need die, and that the person with the idea can stop being its avatar, change his or her ways, and continue. To use the dramatic conceptualization of our ancestors, it is the most fundamental convictions that must die, must be sacrificed, when the relationship with God has been disrupted, when the presence of undue and often intolerable suffering, for example, indicates that something has to change. This is to say nothing other than that the future can be made better if the proper sacrifices take place in the present. No other animal has ever figured this out, and it took us untold hundreds of thousands of years to do it. It took further eons of observation and hero worship, and then millennia of study to distill that idea into a story, and then it took additional vast stretches of time to assess that story, to incorporate it, so that we can now simply say, if you are disciplined and privilege the future over the present, you can change the structure of reality in your favor. But how best to do that? In 1984, I started down the same road as Descartes. I did not know it was the same road at the time, and I am not claiming kinship with Descartes, who is rightly regarded as one of the greatest philosophers of all time. But I was truly plagued with doubt. I had outgrown the shallow Christianity of my youth by the time I could understand the fundamentals of Darwinian theory. After that, I could not distinguish the basic elements of Christian belief from wishful thinking. The socialism that soon afterward became so attractive to me as an alternative proved equally insubstantial. With time, I came to understand through the great George Orwell that much of such thinking found its motivation in hatred of the rich and successful, instead of true regard for the poor. Besides, the socialists were more intrinsically capitalist than the capitalists. They believed just as strongly in money. They just thought that if different people had the money, the problems plaguing humanity would vanish. And this is simply untrue. There are many problems that money does not solve, and others that it makes worse. Rich people still divorce each other and alienate themselves from their children and suffer from existential angst, and develop cancer and dementia, and die alone and unloved. Recovering addicts cursed with money blow it all in a frenzy of snorting and drunkenness. And boredom weighs heavily on people who have nothing to do. I was simultaneously tormented by the fact of the Cold War. It obsessed me. It gave me nightmares. It drove me into the desert, into the long night of the human soul. I could not understand how it came to pass that the world's two great factions aimed mutual assured destruction at each other. Was one system just as arbitrary and corrupt as the other? Was it a mere matter of opinion? Were all value structures merely the clothing of power? Was everyone just crazy? Just exactly what happened in the 20th century anyway? How was it that so many tens of millions had to die, sacrificed to the new dogmas and ideologies? How was it that we discovered something worse, much worse, than the aristocracy and corrupt religious beliefs that communism and fascism sought so rationally to supplant? No one had answered those questions as far as I could tell. Like Descartes, I was plagued with doubt. I searched for one thing, anything I could regard as indisputable. I wanted a rock upon which to build my house. It was doubt that led me to it. I once read of a particularly insidious practice at Auschwitz. A guard would force an inmate to carry a 100-pound sack of wet salt from one side of the large compound to the other, and then to carry it back. Arbeit macht frei, said the sign over the camp entrance. Work will set you free. And the freedom was death. Carrying the salt was an act of pointless torment. It was a piece of malevolent art. It allowed me to realize with certainty that some actions are wrong. Alexander Solzhenitsyn wrote definitively and profoundly about the horrors of the 20th century, the tens of millions who were stripped of employment, family, identity, and life. In his Gulag Archipelago, in the second part of the second volume, he discussed the Nuremberg trials, which he considered the most significant event of the 20th century. The conclusion of those trials? There are some actions that are so intrinsically terrible that they run counter to the proper nature of human being. This is true, essentially, cross-culturally, across time and place. These are evil actions. No excuses are available for engaging in them. To dehumanize a fellow being, to reduce him or her to the status of a parasite, to torture and to slaughter with no consideration of individual innocence or guilt, to make an art form of pain, that is wrong. What can I not doubt? The reality of suffering. It brooks no arguments. Nihilists cannot undermine it with skepticism. Totalitarians cannot banish it. Cynics cannot escape from its reality. Suffering is real, and the artful infliction of suffering on another for its own sake is wrong. That became the cornerstone of my belief. Searching through the lowest reaches of human thought and action, understanding my own capacity to act like a Nazi prison guard or a Gulag archipelago trustee or a torturer of children in a dungeon, I grasped what it meant to take the sins of the world onto oneself. Each human being has an immense capacity for evil. Each human being understands, a priori, perhaps not what is good, but certainly what is not. And if there is something that is not good, then there is something that is good. If the worst sin is the torment of others merely for the sake of suffering produced, then the good is whatever is diametrically opposed to that. The good is whatever stops such things from happening. Meaning as the higher good. It was from this that I drew my fundamental moral conclusions. Aim up. Pay attention. Fix what you can fix. Don't be arrogant in your knowledge. Strive for humility because totalitarian pride manifests itself in intolerance, oppression, torture, and death. Become aware of your own insufficiency, your cowardice, malevolence, resentment, and hatred. Consider the murderousness of your own spirit before you dare accuse others, and before you attempt to repair the fabric of the world. Maybe it's not the world that's at fault. Maybe it's you. Maybe it's you. You've failed to make the mark. You've missed the target. You've fallen short of the glory of God. You've sinned. And all of that is your contribution to the insufficiency and evil of the world. And above all, don't lie. Don't lie about anything, ever. Lying leads to hell. It was the great and the small lies of the Nazi and communist states that produced the deaths of millions of people. Consider then that the alleviation of unnecessary pain and suffering is a good. Make that an axiom. To the best of my ability, I will act in a manner that leads to the alleviation of unnecessary pain and suffering. You have now placed at the pinnacle of your moral hierarchy a set of presuppositions and actions aimed at the betterment of being. Why? Because we know the alternative. The alternative was the 20th century. The alternative was so close to hell that the difference is not worth discussing. And the opposite of hell is heaven. To place the alleviation of unnecessary pain and suffering at the pinnacle of your hierarchy of value is to work to bring about the kingdom of God on earth. That's a state and a state of mind at the same time. Young observed that the construction of such a moral hierarchy was inevitable, although it could remain poorly arranged and internally self-contradictory. For Young, whatever was at the top of an individual's moral hierarchy was, for all intents and purposes, that person's ultimate value, that person's God. It was what the person acted out. It was what the person believed most deeply. Something enacted is not a fact or even a set of facts. Instead, it's a personality. Or more precisely, a choice between two opposing personalities. It's Sherlock Holmes or Moriarty. It's Batman or the Joker. It's Superman or Lex Luthor, Charles Francis Xavier or Magneto, and Thor or Loki. It's Abel or Cain, and it's Christ or Satan. If it's working for the ennobling of being, for the establishment of paradise, then it's Christ. If it's working for the destruction of being, for the generation and propagation of unnecessary suffering and pain, then it's Satan. That's the inescapable archetypal reality. Expedience is the following of blind impulse. It's short-term gain. It's narrow and selfish. It lies to get its way. It takes nothing into account. It's immature and irresponsible. Meaning is its mature replacement. Meaning emerges when impulses are regulated, organized, and unified. Meaning emerges from the interplay between the possibilities of the world and the value structure operating within that world. If the value structure is aimed at the betterment of being, the meaning revealed will be life-sustaining. It will provide the antidote for chaos and suffering. It will make everything matter. It will make everything better. If you act properly, your actions allow you to be psychologically integrated now and tomorrow and into the future, while you benefit yourself, your family, and the broader world around you. Everything will stack up and align along a single axis. Everything will come together. This produces maximal meaning. This stacking up is a place in space and time whose existence we can detect with our ability to experience more than is simply revealed here and now by our senses, which are obviously limited to their information gathering and representational capacity. Meaning trumps expedience. Meaning gratifies all impulses, now and forever. That's why we can detect it. If you decide that you are not justified in your resentment of being, despite its inequity and pain, You may come to notice things you could fix to reduce even by a bit some unnecessary pain and suffering. You may come to ask yourself, what should I do today? In a manner that means, how could I use my time to make things better instead of worse? Such tasks may announce themselves as the pile of undone paperwork that you could attend to, the room that you could make a bit more welcoming, or the meal that could be a bit more delicious and more gratefully delivered to your family. You may find that if you attend to these moral obligations, once you have placed make the world better at the top of your value hierarchy, you experience ever-deepening meaning. It's not bliss. It's not happiness. It is something more like atonement for the criminal fact of your fractured and damaged being. It's payment of the debt you owe for the insane and horrible miracle of your existence. It's how you remember the Holocaust. It's how you make amends for the pathology of history. It's adoption of the responsibility for being a potential denizen of hell. It is willingness to serve as an angel of paradise. Expedience, that's hiding all the skeletons in the closet. That's covering the blood you just spilled with a carpet. That's avoiding responsibility. It's cowardly and shallow and wrong. It's wrong because mere expedience, multiplied by many repetitions, produces the character of a demon. It's wrong because expedience merely transfers the curse on your head to someone else, or to your future self, in a manner that will make your future, and the future generally, worse instead of better. There is no faith and no courage and no sacrifice in doing what is expedient. There is no careful observation that actions and presuppositions matter, or that the world is made of what matters. To have meaning in your life is better than to have what you want, because you may neither know what you want nor what you truly need. Meaning is something that comes upon you of its own accord. You can set up the preconditions, you can follow meaning when it manifests itself, but you cannot simply produce it as an act of will. Meaning signifies that you are in the right place, at the right time, properly balanced between order and chaos, where everything lines up as best it can at that moment. What is expedient works only for the moment. It's immediate, impulsive, and limited. What is meaningful, by contrast, is the organization of what would otherwise merely be expedient into a symphony of being. Meaning is what is put forth more powerfully than mere words can express by Beethoven's Ode to Joy, a triumphant bringing forth from the void of pattern after pattern upon beautiful pattern, every instrument playing its part, disciplined voices layered on top of that, spanning the entire breadth of human emotion from despair to exhilaration. Meaning is what manifests itself when the many levels of being arrange themselves into a perfectly functioning harmony, from atomic microcosm to cell to organ to individual society to nature to cosmos, so that action at each level beautifully and perfectly facilitates action at all, such that past, present, and future are all at once redeemed and reconciled. Meaning is what emerges beautifully and profoundly like a newly formed rosebud opening itself out of nothingness into the light of sun and God. Meaning is the lotus striving upward through the dark lake depths, through the ever-clearing water, blooming forth on the very surface, revealing within itself the golden Buddha, himself perfectly integrated, such that the revelation of the divine will can make itself manifest in his every word and gesture. Meaning is when everything there is comes together in an ecstatic dance of single purpose, the glorification of a reality that no matter how good it has suddenly become, it can get better and better and better, more and more deeply forever into the future. Meaning happens when that dance has become so intense that all the horrors of the past, all the terrible struggle engaged in by all of life and all of humanity to that moment becomes a necessary and worthwhile part of the increasingly successful attempt to build something truly mighty and good. Meaning is the ultimate balance between, on the one hand, the chaos of transformation and possibility, and on the other, the discipline of pristine order whose purpose is to produce out of the attendant chaos a new order that will be even more immaculate and capable of bringing forth a still more balanced and productive chaos and order. Meaning is the way, the path of life more abundant, the place you live when you are guided by love and speaking truth, and when nothing you want or could possibly want takes any precedence over precisely that. Do what is meaningful, not what is expedient. "12 Rules for Life" by Jordan Peterson. Rule number 8. Tell the truth, or at least don't lie. Truth in no man's land. I trained to become a clinical psychologist at McGill University in Montreal. While doing so, I sometimes met my classmates on the grounds of Montreal's Douglas Hospital, where we had our first direct experiences with the mentally ill. The Douglas occupies acres of land and dozens of buildings. Many are connected by underground tunnels to protect workers and patients from the interminable Montreal winters. The hospital once sheltered hundreds of long-term, in-house patients. This was before antipsychotic drugs and the large-scale deinstitutionalization movements of the late 60s all but closed down the residential asylums, most often dooming the now freed patients to a much harder life on the streets. By the early 80s, when I first visited the grounds, all but the most seriously afflicted residents had been discharged. Those who remained were strange, much damaged people. They clustered around the vending machines scattered throughout the hospital's tunnels. They looked as if they had been photographed by Diane Arbus or painted by Hieronymus Bosch. One day, my classmates and I were all standing in line. We were awaiting further instruction from the straight-laced German psychologist who ran the Douglas clinical training program. A long-term inpatient, fragile and vulnerable, approached one of the other students, a sheltered, conservative young woman. The patient spoke to her in a friendly, childlike manner and asked, "Why are you all standing here? What are you doing? Can I come along with you?" My classmate turned to me and asked uncertainly, "What should I say to her?" She was taken aback, just as I was, by this request coming from someone so isolated and hurt. Neither of us wanted to say anything that might be construed as a rejection or a reprimand. We had temporarily entered a kind of no man's land in which society offers no ground rules or guidance. We were new clinical students, unprepared to be confronted on the grounds of a mental hospital by a schizophrenic patient asking a naive, friendly question about the possibility of social belonging. The natural, conversational give and take between people attentive to contextual cues was not happening here either. What exactly were the rules in such a situation far outside the boundaries of normal social interaction? What exactly were the options? There were only two as far as I could quickly surmise. I could tell the patient a story designed to save everyone's face, or I could answer truthfully. "We can only take 8 people in our group" would have fallen into the first category, as would have, "We are just leaving the hospital now." Neither of these answers would have bruised any feelings, at least on the surface, and the presence of the status differences that divided us from her would have gone unremarked. But neither answer would have been exactly true, so I didn't offer either. I told the patient as simply and directly as I could that we were new students training to be psychologists, and that she couldn't join us for that reason. The answer highlighted the distinction between her situation and ours, making the gap between us greater and more evident. The answer was harsher than a well-crafted white lie. But I already had an inkling that untruth, however well meant, can produce unintended consequences. She looked crestfallen and hurt, but only for a moment. Then she understood, and it was all right. That was just how it was. I had a strange set of experiences a few years before embarking upon my clinical training. I found myself subject to some rather violent compulsions, none acted upon, and developed the conviction, in consequence, that I really knew rather little about who I was and what I was up to. So I began paying much closer attention to what I was doing and saying. The experience was disconcerting, to say the least. I soon divided myself into 2 parts, one that spoke, and one more detached, that paid attention and judged. I soon came to realize that almost everything I said was untrue. I had motives for saying these things. I wanted to win arguments and gain status and impress people and get what I wanted. I was using language to bend and twist the world into delivering what I thought was necessary. But I was a fake. Realizing this, I started to practice only saying things that the internal voice would not object to. I started to practice telling the truth, or at least not lying. I soon learned that such a skill came in very handy when I didn't know what to do. What should you do when you don't know what to do? Tell the truth. So that's what I did my first day at the Douglas Hospital. Later, I had a client who was paranoid and dangerous. Working with paranoid people is challenging. They believe they have been targeted by mysterious conspiratorial forces working malevolently behind the scenes. Paranoid people are hyper-alert and hyper-focused. They are attending to nonverbal cues with an intentness never manifest during ordinary human interactions. They make mistakes in interpretation, that's the paranoia, but they are still almost uncanny in their ability to detect mixed motives, judgment, and falsehood. You have to listen very carefully and tell the truth if you are going to get a paranoid person to open up to you. I listened carefully and spoke truthfully to my client. Now and then, he would describe blood-curdling fantasies of flaying people for revenge. I would watch how I was reacting. I paid attention to what thoughts and images emerged in the theater of my imagination while he spoke, and I told him what I observed. I was not trying to control or direct his thoughts or actions, or mine. I was only trying to let him know as transparently as I could how what he was doing was directly affecting at least one person, me. My careful attention and frank responses did not mean at all that I remained unperturbed, let alone approved. I told him when he scared me, often, that his words and behavior were misguided, and that he was going to get into serious trouble. He talked to me nonetheless because I listened and responded honestly, even though I was not encouraging in my responses. He trusted me, despite, or more accurately because of, my objections. He was paranoid, not stupid. He knew his behavior was socially unacceptable. He knew that any decent person was likely to react with horror to his insane fantasies. He trusted me and would talk to me because that's how I reacted. There was no chance of understanding him without that trust. Trouble for him generally started in a bureaucracy, such as a bank. He would enter an institution and attempt some simple task. He was looking to open an account or pay a bill or fix some mistake. Now and then, he encountered the kind of non-helpful person that anyone encounters now and then in such a place. That person would reject the ID he offered or require some information that was unnecessary and difficult to obtain. Sometimes, I suppose, the bureaucratic runaround was unavoidable, but sometimes it was unnecessarily complicated by petty misuses of bureaucratic power. My client was very attuned to such things. He was obsessed with honor. It was more important to him than safety, freedom, or belonging. Following that logic, because paranoid people are impeccably logical, he could never allow himself to be demeaned, insulted, or put down even a little bit by anyone. Water did not roll off his back. Because of his rigid and inflexible attitude, my client's actions had already been subjected to several restraining orders. Restraining orders work best, however, with the sort of person who would never require a restraining order. "I will be your worst nightmare," was his phrase of choice in such situations. I have wished intensely that I could say something like that after encountering unnecessary bureaucratic obstacles, but it's generally best to let such things go. My client meant what he said, however, and sometimes he really did become someone's nightmare. He was the bad guy in No Country for Old Men. He was the person you meet in the wrong place at the wrong time. If you messed with him, even accidentally, he was going to stalk you, remind you what you had done, and scare the living daylights out of you. He was no one to lie to. I told him the truth, and that cooled him off. My landlord. I had a landlord around that time who had been president of a local biker gang. My wife, Tammy, and I lived next door to him in his parents' small apartment building. His girlfriend bore the marks of self-inflicted injuries characteristic of borderline personality disorder. She killed herself while we lived there. Dennis, large, strong, French-Canadian, with a gray beard, was a gifted amateur electrician. He had some artistic talent too, and was supporting himself making laminated wood posters with custom neon lights. He was trying to stay sober after being released from jail. Still, every month or so, he would disappear on a days-long bender. He was one of those men who have a miraculous capacity for alcohol. He could drink 50 or 60 beer in a 2-day binge and remain standing the whole time. This may seem hard to believe, but it's true. I was doing research on familial alcoholism at the time, and it was not rare for my subjects to report their father's habitual consumption of 40 ounces of vodka a day. These patriarchs would buy 1 bottle every afternoon, Monday through Friday, and then 2 on Saturday to tide them over through the Sunday liquor store closure. Dennis had a little dog. Sometimes Tammy and I would hear Dennis and the dog out in the backyard at 4 a.m. during one of Dennis's marathon drinking sessions, both of them howling madly at the moon. Now and then, on occasions like that, Dennis would drink up every cent he had saved. Then he would show up at our apartment. We would hear a knock at night. Dennis would be at the door, swaying precipitously upright and miraculously conscious. He would be standing there, toaster, microwave, or poster in hand. He wanted to sell these to me so he could keep on drinking. I bought a few things like this, pretending that I was being charitable. Eventually, Tammy convinced me that I couldn't do it anymore. It made her nervous, and it was bad for Dennis, whom she liked. Reasonable and even necessary as her request was, it still placed me in a tricky position. What do you say to a severely intoxicated, violence-prone ex-biker gang president with patchy English when he tries to sell his microwave to you at your open door at 2 a.m? This was a question even more difficult than those presented by the institutionalized patient or the paranoid flayer. But the answer was the same. The truth. But you bloody well better know what the truth is. Dennis knocked again soon after my wife and I had talked. He looked at me in the direct, skeptical, narrow-eyed manner characteristic of the tough, heavy drinking man who is no stranger to trouble. That look means, prove your innocence. Weaving slightly back and forth, he asked, politely, if I might be interested in purchasing his toaster. I rid myself to the bottom of my soul of primate dominance motivations and moral superiority. I told him, as directly and carefully as I could, that I would not. I was playing no tricks. In that moment, I wasn't an educated, anglophone, fortunate, upwardly mobile young man. He wasn't an ex-con Quebecois biker with a blood alcohol level of 0.24. No, we were 2 men of goodwill, trying to help each other out in our common struggle to do the right thing. I said that he had told me he was trying to quit drinking. I said that it would not be good for him if I provided him with more money. I said that he made Tammy, whom he respected, nervous when he came over so drunk and so late and tried to sell me things. He glared seriously at me without speaking for about 15 seconds. That was pretty long enough. He was watching, I knew, for any micro-expression revealing sarcasm, deceit, contempt, or self-congratulation. But I had thought it through carefully, and I had only said things I truly meant. I had chosen my words carefully, traversing a treacherous swamp, feeling out a partially submerged stone path. Dennis turned and left. Not only that, he remembered our conversation despite his state of professional level intoxication. He didn't try to sell me anything again. Our relationship, which was quite good, given the great cultural gaps between us, became even more solid. Taking the easy way out or telling the truth, those are not merely 2 different choices. They are different pathways through life. They are utterly different ways of existing. Manipulate the world. You can use words to manipulate the world into delivering what you want. This is what it means to act politically. This is spin. It's the specialty of unscrupulous marketers, salesmen, advertisers, pickup artists, slogan-possessed utopians, and psychopaths. It's the speech people engage in when they attempt to influence and manipulate others. It's what university students do when they write an essay to please the professor, instead of articulating and clarifying their own ideas. It's what everyone does when they want something, and decide to falsify themselves to please and flatter. It's scheming and sloganeering and propaganda. To conduct life like this is to become possessed by some ill-formed desire and then to craft speech and action in a manner that appears likely, rationally, to bring about that end. Typical calculated ends might include to impose my ideological beliefs, to prove that I am or was right, to appear competent, to ratchet myself up the dominance hierarchy, to avoid responsibility, or its twin, to garner credit for others' actions, to be promoted, to attract the lion's share of attention, to ensure that everyone likes me, to garner the benefits of martyrdom, to justify my cynicism, to rationalize my antisocial outlook, to minimize immediate conflict, to maintain my naivety, to capitalize on my vulnerability, to always appear as the sainted one, or, this one is particularly evil, to ensure that it is always my unloved child's fault. These are all examples of what Sigmund Freud's compatriot, the lesser-known Austrian psychologist Alfred Adler, called life lies. Someone living a life lie is attempting to manipulate reality with perception, thought, and action so that only some narrowly desired and predefined outcome is allowed to exist. A life lived in this manner is based consciously or unconsciously on two premises. The first is that current knowledge is sufficient to define what is good, unquestioningly, far into the future. The second is that reality would be unbearable if left to its own devices. The first presumption is philosophically unjustifiable. What you are currently aiming at might not be worth attaining, just as what you are currently doing might be an error. The second is even worse. It is valid only if reality is intrinsically intolerable and simultaneously something that can be successfully manipulated and distorted. Such speaking and thinking requires the arrogance and certainty that the English poet John Milton's genius identified with Satan, God's highest angel, gone most spectacularly wrong. The faculty of rationality inclines dangerously to pride. All I know is all that needs to be known. Pride falls in love with its own creations and tries to make them absolute. I have seen people define their utopia and then bend their lives into knots trying to make it reality. A left-leaning student adopts a trendy anti-authority stance and spends the next 20 years working resentfully to topple the windmills of his imagination. An 18-year-old decides arbitrarily that she wants to retire at 52. She works for 3 decades to make that happen, failing to notice that she made that decision when she was little more than a child. What did she know about her 52-year-old self when still a teenager? Even now, many years later, she has only the vaguest, lowest resolution idea of her post-work Eden. She refuses to notice. What did her life mean if that initial goal was wrong? She's afraid of opening Pandora's box where all the troubles of the world reside. But hope is in there too. Instead, she warps her life to fit the fantasies of a sheltered adolescent. A naively formulated goal transmutes with time into the sinister form of the life lie. One 40-something client told me his vision formulated by his younger self. I see myself retired, sitting on a tropical beach drinking margaritas in the sunshine. That's not a plan, that's a travel poster. After 8 margaritas, you're fit only to await the hangover. After 3 weeks of margarita-filled days, if you have any sense, you're bored stiff and self-disgusted. In a year or less, you're pathetic. It's just not a sustainable approach to later life. This kind of oversimplification and falsification is particularly typical of ideologues. They adopt a single axiom. Government is bad, immigration is bad, capitalism is bad, patriarchy is bad. Then they filter and screen their experiences and insist ever more narrowly that everything can be explained by that axiom. They believe narcissistically underneath all that bad theory that the world could be put right if only they held the controls. There is another fundamental problem too with the life lie, particularly when it is based on avoidance. A sin of commission occurs when you do something you know to be wrong. A sin of omission occurs when you let something bad happen when you could do something to stop it. The former is regarded classically as more serious than the latter, than avoidance. I'm not so sure. Consider the person who insists that everything is right in her life. She avoids conflict and smiles and does what she's asked to do. She finds a niche and hides in it. She does not question authority or put her own ideas forward and does not complain when mistreated. She strives for invisibility, like a fish in the center of a swarming school. But a secret unrest gnaws at her heart, She's still suffering because life is suffering. She is lonesome and isolated and unfulfilled, but her obedience and self-obliteration eliminate all the meaning from life. She has become nothing but a slave, a tool for others to exploit. She does not get what she wants or needs because doing so would mean speaking her mind, so there is nothing of value in her existence to counterbalance life's troubles, and that makes her sick. It might be the noisy troublemakers who disappear first when the institution you serve falters and shrinks, but it's the invisible who will be sacrificed next. Someone hiding is not someone vital. Vitality requires original contribution. Hiding also does not save the conforming and conventional from disease, insanity, death, and taxes. And hiding from others also means suppressing and hiding the potentialities of the unrealized self. And that's the problem. If you do not reveal yourself to others, you cannot reveal yourself to yourself. That does not only mean that you suppress who you are, although it also means that. It means that so much of what you could be will never be forced by necessity to come forward. This is a biological truth as well as a conceptual truth. When you explore boldly, when you voluntarily confront the unknown, you gather information and build your renewed self out of that information. That is the conceptual element. However, researchers have recently discovered that new genes in the central nervous system turn themselves on when an organism is placed, or places itself, in a new situation. These genes code for new proteins. These proteins are the building blocks for new structures in the brain. This means that a lot of you is still nascent, in the most physical senses, and will not be called forth by stasis. You have to say something, go somewhere, and do things to get turned on, and if not, you remain incomplete, and life is too hard for anyone incomplete. If you say no to your boss or your spouse or your mother when it needs to be said, then you transform yourself into someone who can say no when it needs to be said. If you say yes when no needs to be said, however, you transform yourself into someone who can only say yes, even when it is very clearly time to say no. If you ever wonder how perfectly ordinary, decent people could find themselves doing the terrible things the Gulag camp guards did, you now have your answer. By the time no seriously needed to be said, there was no one left capable of saying it. If you betray yourself, if you say untrue things, if you act out a lie, you weaken your character. If you have a weak character, then your adversity will mow you down when it appears, as it will inevitably. You will hide, but there will be no place left to hide, and then you will find yourself doing terrible things. Only the most cynical, hopeless philosophy insists that reality could be improved through falsification. Such a philosophy judges being and becoming alike and deems them flawed. It denounces truth as insufficient and the honest man as deluded. It is a philosophy that both brings about and then justifies the endemic corruption of the world. It is not vision as such, and not a plan devised to achieve a vision, that is at fault under such circumstances. A vision of the future, the desirable future, is necessary. Such a vision links action taken now with important long-term foundational values. It lends actions in the present significance and importance. It provides a frame-limiting uncertainty and anxiety. It's not vision. It is instead willful blindness. It's the worst sort of lie. It's subtle. It avails itself of easy rationalizations. Willful blindness is the refusal to know something that could be known. It's refusal to admit that the knocking sound means someone at the door. It's refusal to acknowledge the 800-pound gorilla in the room, the elephant under the carpet, the skeleton in the closet. It's refusal to admit to error while pursuing the plan. Every game has rules. Some of the most important rules are implicit. You accept them merely by deciding to play the game. The first of these rules is that the game is important. If it wasn't important, you wouldn't be playing it. Playing a game defines it as important. The second is that moves undertaken during the game are valid if they help you win. If you make a move and it isn't helping you win, then by definition it's a bad move. You need to try something different. You remember the old joke. Insanity is doing the same thing over and over while expecting different results. If you're lucky and you fail and you try something new, you move ahead. If that doesn't work, you try something different again. A minor modification will suffice in fortunate circumstances. It is therefore prudent to begin with small changes and see if they help. Sometimes, however, the entire hierarchy of values is faulty and the whole edifice has to be abandoned. The whole game must be changed. That's a revolution with all the chaos and terror of a revolution. It's not something to be engaged in lightly, but it's sometimes necessary. Error necessitates sacrifice to correct it, and serious error necessitates serious sacrifice. To accept the truth means to sacrifice, and if you have rejected the truth for a long time, then you've run up a dangerously large sacrificial debt. Forest fires burn out deadwood and return trapped elements to the soil. Sometimes, however, fires are suppressed artificially. That does not stop the deadwood from accumulating. Sooner or later, the fire will start. And when it does, it will burn so hot that everything will be destroyed, even the soil in which the forest grows. The prideful, rational mind, comfortable with its certainty, enamored of its own brilliance, is easily tempted to ignore error and to sweep dirt under the rug. Literary, existential philosophers, beginning with Soren Kierkegaard, conceived of this mode of being as inauthentic. An inauthentic person continues to perceive and act in ways his own experience has demonstrated false. He does not speak with his own voice. Did what I want happen? No. Then my aim or my methods were wrong. I still have something to learn. That is the voice of authenticity. Did what I want happen? No. Then the world is unfair. People are jealous and too stupid to understand. It is the fault of something or someone else. That is the voice of inauthenticity. It is not too far from there to, they should be stopped, or they must be hurt, or they must be destroyed. Whenever you hear about something incomprehensibly brutal, such ideas have manifested themselves. There is no blaming any of this on unconsciousness either, or repression. When the individual lies, he knows it. He may blind himself to the consequences of his actions. He may fail to analyze and articulate his past so that he does not understand. He may even forget that he lied and so be unconscious of that fact. But he was conscious in the present during the commission of each error and the omission of each responsibility. At that moment, he knew what he was up to, and the sins of the inauthentic individual compound and corrupt the state. Someone power-hungry makes a new rule at your workplace. It's unnecessary, it's counterproductive, it's an irritant. It removes some of the pleasure and meaning from your work. But you tell yourself it's all right, it's not worth complaining about. Then it happens again. You've already trained yourself to allow such things by failing to react the first time. You're a little less courageous. Your opponent, unopposed, is a little bit stronger. The institution is a little bit more corrupt. The process of bureaucratic stagnation and oppression is underway, and you've contributed by pretending that it was okay. Why not complain? Why not take a stand? If you do, other people equally afraid to speak up may come to your defense. And if not, maybe it's time for a revolution. Maybe you should find a job somewhere else where your soul is less in danger from corruption. For what shall it profit a man if he gain the whole world and forfeit his soul? Mark chapter 8, verse 36. One of the major contributions of Alexander Solzhenitsyn's masterwork, The Gulag Archipelago, was his analysis of the direct causal relationship between the pathology of the Soviet prison work camp dependent state, where millions suffered and died, and the almost universal proclivity of the Soviet citizen to falsify his own day-to-day personal experience, deny his own state-induced suffering, and thereby prop up the dictates of the rational, ideology-possessed communist system. It was this bad faith, this denial, that in Solzhenitsyn's opinion aided and abetted the great, paranoid mass murderer Joseph Stalin in his crimes. Solzhenitsyn wrote the truth, his truth hard-learned through his own experiences in the camp, exposing the lies of the Soviet state. No educated person dared defend that ideology again after Solzhenitsyn published The Gulag Archipelago. No one could ever say again, what Stalin did, that was not true communism. Viktor Frankl, the psychiatrist and Nazi concentration camp survivor who wrote the classic Man's Search for Meaning, drew a similar social psychological conclusion. Deceitful, inauthentic, individual existence is the precursor to social totalitarianism. Sigmund Freud, for his part, analogously believed that repression contributed in a non-trivial manner to the development of mental illness, and the difference between repression of truth and a lie is a matter of degree, not kind. Alfred Adler knew it was lies that bred sickness. C.G. Jung knew that moral problems plagued his patients and that such problems were caused by untruth. All these thinkers, all centrally concerned with pathology, both individual and cultural, came to the same conclusion. Lies warp the structure of being. Untruth corrupts the soul and the state alike, and one form of corruption feeds the other. I have repeatedly observed the transformation of mere existential misery into outright hell by betrayal and deceit. The barely manageable crisis of a parent's terminal illness can be turned, for example, into something awful beyond description by the unseemly and petty squabbling of the sufferer's adult children. Obsessed by the unresolved past, they gather like ghouls around the deathbed, forcing tragedy into an unholy dalliance with cowardice and resentment. The inability of a son to thrive independently is exploited by a mother bent on shielding her child from all disappointment and pain. He never leaves, and she is never lonely. It's an evil conspiracy forged slowly as the pathology unfolds by thousands of knowing winks and nods. She plays the martyr, doomed to support her son, and garners nourishing sympathy like a vampire from supporting friends. He broods in his basement, imagining himself oppressed. He fantasizes with delight about the havoc he might wreak on the world that rejected him for his cowardice, awkwardness, and inability. And sometimes he wreaks precisely that havoc, and everyone asks why. They could know, but refuse to. Even well-lived lives can, of course, be warped and hurt and twisted by illness and infirmity and uncontrollable catastrophe. Depression, bipolar disorder, and schizophrenia, like cancer, all involve biological factors beyond the individual's immediate control. The difficulties intrinsic to life itself are sufficient to weaken and overwhelm each of us, pushing us beyond our limits, breaking us at our weakest point. Not even the best-lived life provides an absolute defense against vulnerability. But the family that fights in the ruins of their earthquake-devastated dwelling place is much less likely to rebuild than the family made strong by mutual trust and devotion. Any natural weakness or existential challenge, no matter how minor, can be magnified into a serious crisis with enough deceit in the individual family or culture. The honest human spirit may continually fail in its attempts to bring about paradise on earth. It may manage, however, to reduce the suffering attendant on existence to bearable levels. The tragedy of being is the consequence of our limitations and the vulnerability defining human experience. It may even be the price we pay for being itself, since existence must be limited to be at all. I have seen a husband adapt honestly and courageously while his wife descended into terminal dementia. He made the necessary adjustments, step by step. He accepted help when he needed it. He refused to deny her sad deterioration, and in that manner adapted gracefully to it. I saw the family of that same woman come together in supporting and sustaining manner as she lay dying and gain newfound connections with each other, brothers, sisters, grandchildren, and father, as partial but genuine compensation for their loss. I have seen my teenage daughter live through the destruction of her hip and her ankle and survive 2 years of continual intense pain and emerge with her spirit intact. I watched her younger brother voluntarily and without resentment sacrifice many opportunities for a friendship and social engagement to stand by her and us while she suffered. With love, encouragement, and character intact, a human being can be resilient beyond imagining. What cannot be borne, however, is the absolute ruin produced by tragedy and deception. The capacity of the rational mind to deceive, manipulate, scheme, trick, falsify, minimize, mislead, betray, prevaricate, deny, omit, rationalize, bias, exaggerate, and obscure is so endless, so remarkable that centuries of pre-scientific thought concentrating on clarifying the nature of moral endeavor regarded it as positively demonic. This is not because of rationality itself as a process. That process can produce clarity and progress. It is because rationality is subject to the single worst temptation, to raise what it knows now to the status of an absolute. We can turn to the great poet John Milton once again to clarify just what this means. Over thousands of years of history, the Western world wrapped a dreamlike fantasy about the nature of evil around its central religious core. That fantasy had a protagonist, an adversarial personality absolutely dedicated to the corruption of being. Milton took it upon himself to organize, dramatize, and articulate the essence of his collective dream and give it life in the figure of Satan, Lucifer, the light-bearer. He writes of Lucifer's primal temptation and its immediate consequences. He trusted to have equaled the Most High, if he opposed and with ambitious aim against the throne and monarchy of God, raised impious war in heaven and battle proud. With vain attempt, him, the almighty power, hurled headlong flaming from ethereal sky, with hideous ruin and combustion down, to bottomless perdition there to dwell, in adamantine chains and penal fire. Lucifer, in Milton's eyes, the spirit of reason, was the most wondrous angel brought forth from the void by God. This can be read psychologically. Reason is something alive. It lives in all of us. It's older than any of us. It's best understood as a personality, not a faculty. It has its aims and its temptations and its weaknesses. It flies higher and sees farther than any other spirit. But reason falls in love with itself and worse. It falls in love with its own productions. It elevates them and worships them as absolutes. Lucifer is, therefore, the spirit of totalitarianism. He is flung from heaven into hell because such elevation, such rebellion against the highest and incomprehensible, inevitably